Man's inhumanity to man. Let's think about that. Man's inhumanity to man. What an unusual statement that is. It's a paradox, actually. How can we be both human and yet inhuman at the same time? It's almost poetic. In fact, the first time this phrase was ever used was by Scotsman Robert Burns over 200 years ago in a poem entitled, "Man Was Made to Mourn." In the middle of this dour Scottish dirge, Burns declares, "Man's inhumanity to man makes countless thousands mourn." And when we look back over the last century, how prophetic and yet understated those words are. Thousands mourn? More like millions upon millions mourning. And perhaps the most heinous act of man's inhumanity to man is the genocide, the intentional murder of unarmed and helpless people by a government because of their identity. This evening, we have speakers who will discuss the genocide in the Darfur region of Sudan. This is perhaps the most recent episode of genocide that is still going on today, even as I speak. But there are countless examples of genocide throughout modern history. The Mongol leader Genghis Khan in the 14th and 15th century slaughtered up to 30 million people in the Middle East, Eastern Europe, Persia, and China. 30 million people. Back then, that was 13% of the world population. Just think about that. The Spanish conquistadors murdered 13 million native Aztecs when they came to the New World. The settlers of the early United States murdered millions of Native Americans, and those that weren't killed were forced to march and relocate thousands of miles away from their ancestral lands. And let's not forget about slavery, which some estimate is responsible for the deaths of 17 million blacks worldwide. The Armenian Genocide, in which 1.5 million lives were lost, the Shoah, or the Holocaust, the purges by Lenin and Stalin, the killing fields of the Khmer Rouge, the Srebrenica massacres in Bosnia. Each of these events is a black stain on the morality of the human race. We hope that through recognizing the past and condemning genocide, those who wish to remove a race of people from the face of the earth will think twice before commencing their barbaric acts. But let us never, as one misguided writer in today's news press encourages, let us never look to the victims to find some rationale, to find some reason for genocide. For these victims have paid the ultimate price for man's inhumanity to man. Ladies and gentlemen, our first speaker is Father Vazken Movsesian. He was born in LA, educated at USC, and received a bachelor's in psychology and religion, and received his master's in social ethics. He then went on to the seminary at Holy Etchmiadzin in Armenia. He was ordained into the priesthood in 1982. In 1996, he was the pastor at St. Gregory's Armenian Church in Pasadena. And from 2003 to the present, he is the priest at St. Peter's Armenian Church and Youth Ministries here in Glendale. And he's currently the director of In His Shoes Ministries. And he has a very long history of broadcasting that I won't go through, but I'm sure you'll see that he is quite a personality when it comes to this. So I would like to introduce everyone to Father Vazken Movsesian.
Well, good evening, and thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here, especially with the week coming to an end, a week of remembrance for the Armenian genocide. What I'd like to do this evening is reflect a little bit about the Armenian genocide, why it is important to remember 91 years later. Is this okay? Are you hearing me? Why it's important to remember 91 years later, and then to give you a little bit of information about a recent trip that I took to Rwanda. And it was an opportunity to meet with genocide survivors 10 years after, or a decade after the genocide. Let me tell you something that happened. In the last year, I get called to speak at different genocide commemorations. And it was last year we were at the University of Texas, and a professor from Boston was there, one of the speakers, and I was one of the speakers. We spoke about the genocide, and we talked about, and you got to remember, in Texas, this was the first chance that Armenians in Texas had grouped together and were discussing the Armenian genocide. And sure enough, here we were talking about 1.5 million people dying and the brutality of the genocide, when all of a sudden we heard a commotion, and there they were in the University of Texas auditorium, a group of hecklers who started challenging the genocide. And sure enough, it was a group of Turkish students which were exercising their right of free speech and were challenging the points of genocide. Is it possible that the Armenians maybe killed some Turks too? And because they did that, did the Armenians perpetrate genocide on Turks and everything? And as with all the facts that we have, of course, we shut them up right there. But the bigger issue that came to my mind was the ability for the Turkish government today to have a campaign to change history, and the nerve of these people that they were able to get up and challenge the Armenian genocide, that how crippled we were, that we had to defend something that we know is very true. And we go through this every year, because there's no closure to the Armenian genocide. We have to prove it over and over. And I'm at that point where I said a few years ago, I said, I'm tired of proving it. My grandparents told me the stories. I don't need Bush to tell me that it's a genocide and not a massacre. But I think that some people do. And it occurred to me last year when we got into this that it would never occur for a group of Germans to get up. They wouldn't have the audacity to get up and challenge somebody who was talking about the Holocaust. You couldn't imagine a group of white Puritans getting up and challenging somebody who said that, slavery happened here in America a few centuries ago. What would happen? They'd shut them up immediately. But today, there's this idea that it's okay to challenge. Let's discuss something that's happened. And to me, that's out of the question. I know what's happened. I've watched my grandparents as they've told the stories. I've watched the silence in their eyes. I've heard the stories of how my grandmother had to go through the desert with one child in her arms, dripping of malaria while she's digging a grave for her 2-year-old child to put it in, an unmarked grave. This was last year when this happened, and I realized that this is enough, that we have to get beyond this. There has to be something more as Armenians that we need to be doing, besides just talking about an event that happened 90 years ago. It was the beginning of this year when we had a funeral. One of my parishioners told me his uncle had passed away, 100-year-old man. His name is Garbis Hagopian, genocide survivor. The genocide survivors are really incredible people. They did what God does. You know what the Bible says? God took nothing and created something. That's what genocide survivors did. They had absolutely nothing. They were left with zero, and they made something. They created a life. They created community. They created families. And here was Garbis Hagopian at the end of his road, 100 years he had lived, and an interesting story came out at his funeral. He had authored this story called Why I Hate Dogs. Now, can you imagine somebody hating dogs? Aren't they all so cute? Especially here in America, we spend billions of dollars to feed these poor little animals. And yet, this man said, I hate dogs. Well, it's interesting because he was 9 years old when the genocide happened. He watched his parents get slaughtered by the Turks. He watched his parents die in front of him after his mother was raped. And as a 9-year-old boy, he had the dignity to want to see a grave for his parents. And in that, this is such a bizarre idea, in that area, he digs a grave and he puts his parents in there. 9-year-old kid burying his parents that he saw Turks kill. And just as he finishes the grave, of course a shallow grave, some dogs come. They start digging up the corpses. They start eating at the flesh. And he goes out as a little 9-year-old and tries to get the dogs to move away, and the dogs growl at him. They come at him with the teeth. And as a crying little boy, he walks away. And you know what? If Garbius was a single person, you'd say this is the worst story that I've ever heard. But the bigger tragedy is that Garbius is not a unique story. There are thousands of stories like this. Thousands of stories. And this is only one. And it occurred to me that this is a story that doesn't belong to Armenian people. When we talk about inhumanity, the word doesn't even cover it. This is not an inhumane act. Inhumane would imply that animals would do something like this. Animals don't go around killing people like this. Imagine a 9-year-old child watching his parents die and then. Well, a few months ago, Don Miller, who is a professor at USC, him and his wife, Lorna Miller, had been making trips to Rwanda and had been documenting the genocide. Those of you who are familiar with their work, about 10, 15 years ago, they wrote a book called Survivors, which chronicled documented 100 survivors of the Armenian genocide. And they were going back to Rwanda, and they asked if I would go along with them. And of course, I jumped at the chance for a couple reasons, but probably the biggest reason was I wanted to know what it would be like to go to Armenia in 1925. What would it be like to be in post-genocide Armenia, a decade after the genocide? So I said, let's go to Rwanda in 2006. And we got to Rwanda, and I'm not sure how many pictures we're going to be able to show. So are you with me so far? Okay, because what I want to do is I want to be able to, if the pictures don't work, I'm going to give you the visual. I'm going to poetically describe to you what I saw. But let's see if can we do up on the view? Let's see if we could just do a slide. Okay, let's leave it right there. In Rwanda, when we got to Rwanda, one of the things that just hit me, the first thing that hit me was they took us to, first of all, we got on Rwanda Airlines. And if you've never been on Rwanda Airlines, it's worth it. It comes very close to Armenian Airlines. And imagine, we knew we were not in America anymore when we got a piece of cake and they gave us a knife. And we said, hey, we have a knife. And we're sitting on an airline. Well, sure enough, we were on the entire fleet of Rwanda Air. When we got there, we asked the people who were picking us up, did you have to wait for us? And the lady very naturally said, no, Father. She says, we wait, and when we hear the plane go over our house, we drive to the airport. So we were the plane for the day. And so we got to Rwanda Airport, and we were taken to the first stop was the Genocide Museum. And can you close this one and see if, is there a folder that says Genocide Museum? If there is, let's go to there. And when we got to the Genocide Museum, that's okay. You know what? Go back to the Natarama Church. That was a nice picture. We got to the Genocide Museum, and what was really unique about it was there was this incredible, like size of a couple football fields of cement. And that was the museum's entrance. And we walked on that cement and looked on at Kigali, which is the capital of Rwanda. And all of a sudden, every so often on the cement, you'd see flowers. I thought that was kind of interesting until we found out that we are walking on a mass grave. There were 260,000 people buried in this cement slab. And as they found bones, as they found remains, they put them into this cement cemetery. So we see these coffins that are being brought in regularly. Now, we walk into the Genocide Memorial Museum in Kigali. This is in the deepest, darkest Africa, right in the center, Rwanda. We're right on the equator. We walk into that museum and we start seeing pictures just like this on the walls of what they have been through. And you cannot imagine the tears that were coming to my eyes, because every story that I read was the same stories that my grandparents had told me. Nothing had changed. Now, this isn't my battle, but if any of you are ever interested in battling against evolution, just point to genocide. We have not evolved. There is no such thing as evolution. People have de-evolved. We've tried everything we can to go backwards in time when it comes to genocide. Because the horror, the crimes, were just repeating themselves. We're reading about the women who were being raped, the men who were being killed, taken away from their families. And I was a mess. I was crying there. I saw a picture of a young boy standing in a big picture, and I imagined my grandfather, because my grandfather was just about that age, a little boy. We think of our grandparents, we think of genocide survivors, old people. They were little people. And one of the attendants there saw me in this rather unusual state. And she came up to me. Everybody talks French or Kinyarwanda. Very few speak English, but she spoke English. And she came if everything was okay. And I explained to her that, I am the grandchild of genocide survivors. At which genocide? I said, Armenian. Now, you got to imagine what happens to this woman. She takes me by the hand. She says, there's something you need to see. And she takes me upstairs to the second level of the Genocide Memorial. There are 2 rooms dedicated to the Armenian genocide. In the deepest, darkest Africa, here they are, America, George Bush still has to figure out if it's a genocide. Here they are in Africa with 2 giant rooms that say Armenian genocide. Not massacre, not maybe it happened, but here's the genocide. I'm looking and I'm seeing pictures, the same pictures we've seen in the books, the Syrian desert, the desert stories, everything written in Kinyarwanda, in French and in English, on 2 giant rooms. And you walk through it and you see these beautiful things. I mean, you know what that does to you? It makes you realize that you have an obligation. It is not enough to just sit here and put a flag on your car and say, I'm Armenian and we were the first genocide. It means you have an obligation because the rest of the world is looking at you and you're a hero to them. You're a hero to them. I felt like, oh man, here we are, Rwanda. Well, it just got better after that. It really did, because we started seeing that we started sharing a pain, a suffering. And that's what I need to impress upon you tonight, is that when you see things like that, you start walking in the shoes of other people. You start understanding that their pain is your pain. And it's not enough that you say that, oh, I have a history. It's realizing that our histories are really intertwined. They really do intersect at many levels. And so from there, we went on and we saw a few different places. We went to the Natrama church. 5,000 people were killed in this church. Let's see if we can do some slides over here. And I apologize, I just did not bring the right coupler for my computer to this. When you go into, yes, these are graphic images, the next images. When you go into this church, it is, you see the bones. You see the skulls left there. 5,000 people hid in this church. The priest sold them out. The priest told them, come in, and then he ran. And they were all stuck in there. This is, you see that there's still some of the rubbish. I want you to think that I'm seeing this with the story of little Garbis Hagopian still fresh in my mind, of why I hate dogs, and realizing that, you know, a lot of this rubble is there. Stop on this one. Take a look at that. That's the altar. The altar where Jesus Christ's name is being given on Sundays, and yet it became the final resting place for 5,000 people. And you know what I thought about? My ordaining bishop, some of you who know him, Archbishop Vache, he's a very tough, big guy. When he returned from Der Zor about 15 years ago, I've never seen such a big man cry. And when he described how he put his hand through the sand and felt the bones. And I was there and seeing not something 80 years ago, but something 10 years ago. And it occurred to me that, can you imagine if we had just a couple people with a few cameras that were able to be in Armenia in 1925? If just a couple people had taken the effort to do this, maybe, just maybe, the world would have stopped. Maybe Hitler would not have said, who after all today remembers the annihilation of the Armenians? Maybe Hitler would have been maybe just a little backed off on entering into Poland. Maybe Pol Pot wouldn't have gotten away with the things that he got away. Maybe. We can go on. But at least today we were here. I can't look at the maybes, but I know something. I know that this has happened. This is a reality. Go to the next slide. And throughout all of what you see here is the debris. Those are bones. Those are actual bones. There is a hairpiece. Now, they've put these skulls on display, and there's a reason for this. You see, this is how they died. You see those skulls that are smashed? These were hit by hammers. One of the ladies came up to me, and this is something that I learned. I learned that the word machete is not a noun only. It is a verb. You are macheted to death. I didn't understand this until one of the ladies, one of the orphans, told me. She said she had to watch her mother be macheted to death. She says, you got to understand, Father, that a machete does not cut the head off. It's not sharp. You have to hack at the head until the head comes off. You see the cracks on the heads. That's why I'm telling you, when you talk about inhumanity, that word does not even come close to what these people are doing. That's why today when you think about Darfur, it's easy to say somewhere on the other side of the planet. It's easy to say that, well, you know, they're all Muslim over there anyway. It's easy to say, well, you know what? Maybe they have too much population anyway. The reality is that there are people that are being hacked, that are dying. And you know what happened? This story in 1994 was not covered. Nobody cared about this. This was happening. Bill Clinton knew about this. You all saw Hotel Rwanda. We stayed at Hotel Rwanda. You want to talk about ghosts? Where we stayed, in the rooms that we stayed, imagine the same rooms where they were killing people. We stayed at that hotel. People knew this and they closed their eyes. Well, you know what? 1915, the New York Times was writing about Armenian genocide. 1915, Henry Morgenthau was writing to his government, the United States, about genocide. In 1915, there were pictures coming over, travelers coming over, and what did the world do? See no evil, speak no evil. Sorry to take the line. The classic cliche of let's close off all of our senses and maybe it won't exist. And that's what we're doing today in Darfur. The next speaker will be addressing more on Darfur, so let me just talk about what we saw in Rwanda. In Rwanda, this was probably the most gruesome of all the shots we saw. We went to a gathering of widows. Let's take a look. It's probably not the Avega. Hold on. Tallest women's group. Oh, you are too good. I'm going to give you a raise. Okay, hold it. Right there. Is it one of my boys? Yeah, okay. We went to a widow's gathering. Now, do you see these boys playing soccer? Let's go, next one. They are having so much fun playing soccer until we got close to them and we wanted to see the ball. It's a bunch of trash. They've taken trash and put it together and tied it up, and that's their soccer ball. And yet you can't find more happy people. I wanted to show you this next, because after the tragedy, you've got to understand that people have picked up and they're moving forward. Now, there is a big difference between this genocide and the Armenian genocide, and good and bad parts of it. Armenian genocide, just like Rwandan genocide, took place in our own homeland. Armenian genocide, most of the Armenians were exiled, were taken out of their homeland. In Rwanda, they stayed. They had the opportunity. Now, that presents other interesting situations where people are living with the people, the perpetrators. This is an incredibly, it's a very, very deep, in fact, very religious kind of experience for me, because you've got to realize that I met people who said that my neighbor across the street is the guy that killed my mother. The guy down the street is the guy that hacked my father. And you can't imagine. I mean, you talk about bizarre realities. How do you live in a situation? Anyway, let's go on. These kids were having so much fun over here. Look at those faces. Now, wait, can you go back to 1 minute? Now, back one more. Okay, now, this guy took my Bic pen out of my pocket. Well, I gave it to him. That was so many. Now, look at these smiles here. Now, how many Game Boys, how many Nintendos do we have to give our kids to get these kind of smiles? And look at these smiles. With what? Now, those of you who are Armenian and have had Armenian grandparents or have had survivors of the genocide, tell me the similar story in our case. Where our grandparents, with that generation of survivors, were just so content with the little things that they had that made them smile with just the small things. And I saw this. And in a way, when I saw these children, I was looking back in time. I was looking back 80, 90 years because I started seeing my grandparents. My grandparents playing in the orphanages, playing with one another, and developing those relationships. These are all a bunch of kids. They all come up to you and they say, bonjour. And luckily, I had remembered that word from high school French, bonjour. Now, stop here. This was the gathering of widows. These are about 200 of them gather once a week, and they help one another get through life. Let's go forward. This is one of the speakers. Jean was the gentleman from Solace Ministries who had some very deep emotional experiences and was helping this gathering. The next slide. At this point, we asked them, how many of you are widows? All of them were widows. The question here that they're answering, how many of you have HIV/AIDS? How many of you have HIV/AIDS? Why? Well, there was something that I started noticing. It didn't dawn on me until the second or third day that I was in Rwanda. There were no gray hair people. Everybody was young. And it occurred to me that's what they did during the genocide. The only people left at the genocide were the little kids, the orphans, and the widows who had HIV/AIDS and were isolated in a separate colony. Why did they let them live? The perpetrator figured if they were infected with AIDS, they didn't need to kill them. They would kill themselves, and they would be an agent for them by spreading the disease. Hey, if you're going to kill a population, there's a few ways. You could do it with machete or with AIDS. And so this group was there looking for help, looking for support. There's a beautiful word in the English language, comfort. I love that word. It means coming together and being a fort, being a strength. And that's what these people were doing. They were making a comfort. They were making a fort. Let's go forward on the next. These are some of the faces. Now, let's go back. Don Miller said, we have a priest of the Armenian church here, and we'd like him to speak. So I got up in front of these ladies, and the gentleman next to me started translating in their language. Now, I had no idea what I was going to say because I wasn't even prepared. You've got to imagine, I'm a grandson of a genocide survivor. My grandparents have given me these stories. I was an emotional mess. I'm sitting there trembling, looking at these people and looking back in time. And all of a sudden they say, well, Father Vazken, he's going to speak. So I get up in front of that, and I don't know. I know God gives you the strength at times like this. And I looked at them, and I said, I'm from America to be with you. And they had the blankest look in their face. Like, what's this white man doing talking to us? In fact, at one point, we got so excited because when we got there, there was a bunch of kids running with us next to the van. And they're yelling, blah, 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 blah. They're yelling something. And we said, what are they saying? Because we got so excited. They said, the white folks are here. The white folks are here. Okay, so we went in there, and there they are. They're all looking at me with blank expressions. I said, you know what? I said, I'm a priest of the Armenian church. The Armenian church, we were the first Christian nation. You know when we were Christian was in the year 40. And then the guy who's translating translates something, and then he looks at me and he says, 40? Like, you mean 400? And I said, no, 40. I said, apostles, you know, apostles, time of Jesus. He says, 40. Then he calls over another translator, and yes, it's true, it's 40. Still, that wasn't impressive to the people. Then I said, I am the grandson of genocide survivors. You could not believe the smiles on these faces, the warmth in that room. And I started talking, and I looked at them, and I said, I see my grandmother there. I see my grandfather over there. And we are all one. And all of a sudden, it occurred to me that I was living a dream that I had always wanted to have. I wanted to be colorblind. I didn't want to put a differentiation between people. And all of a sudden, in these black people, I was seeing my ancestors. And I realized that I found my dream. We are colorblind when it comes to pain. There is no Armenian, there is no Rwandan, there is just people who all suffer, who go through difficulties. Go to the next one. This is a woman who got up and she shared her pain afterwards. Keep going on a few of these. This woman became my grandmother. Imagine, my grandmother died 20 years ago. I met her again. She's 21 years old. When the genocide happened, she was 11 years old. She watched her mother throw herself into the Nile River. She had to raise her 5 siblings. My grandmother watched her mother throw herself into the Euphrates River, had to raise 5 of her siblings at the age of 11. There it was. There it was. I had gone back in time. And she started talking like so strong. She was so strong. And then she broke down. I was waiting for that to happen. I can't imagine anybody talking through this. This is Chip Murray. He was the pastor over at AME. He was in our group. And all of a sudden, something unique happened in that room. The ladies got up and said, we need a hug. Well, we could afford that. So let's go. Look at those smiles. You know, this is a woman with that was a machete mark on her face. She lifted up her shirt on her back, 3 of them, right across her back. Machetes can't take off a head, just maim them. Now I want you to see those smiles and those hugs. You know what? We think that we can cure everything by giving people money, dollars. In fact, one of the girls came up to us and she told us her story, and we turned to her and we said, "What can we do for you?" And you know, typical American mentality. Well, she'll probably give us a little list, and we'll go to Costco, fill up the list, and then give it back to her. You know what she asked for? She says, "I'd like advice on how to improve myself." Wow. She wanted the tools to be able to improve herself. Think about the generation of survivors of genocide. Keep going. Look at these smiles. This was one of the few widowers. You don't find too many of them, but this man was a widower. Now, just a few minutes ago, remember, there was no smiles in these faces. But as soon as they found out that there was an Armenian genocide survivor, these people changed and they opened up. Now, I believe that I'm hitting some time, so I'm going to just wrap it up with this, okay? There's a lot more pictures, and I would invite you, we'll set up some times where we could do some of those. But what I would really invite you is really look at pain universally. Take a look at what's going on. Those of you who are Armenian, don't be content with just remembering a bit of history. We have too much history to really just let it go on as something in a book. History is happening right now. Our biggest challenge today is Darfur. The next speaker will be talking about that. Right now it's happening. And I want to end with this story. On the plane going from British Airways, if you've flown on British Airways, they have those cute little computer screens right on the back of the chair in front of you. And they show you where you're going. And for some reason, they have an awful graphic. It's this giant airplane, which is disproportionate to the rest of the continents. And I'm sitting there in the airplane, and I'm watching this plane go from England down to Nairobi, where our plane was going to land. And as it's going, the towns, it shows you that we're going over Egypt and all of a sudden it's going over Darfur. It tells you, going up. And I just thought to myself, you know, this is it. Below us, 30,000 feet below us, there are women who are being raped. There are men who are being killed. There are children who are being molested. What are we doing? We're just going. That's what the world is doing today. Lying over it. We need to start taking this challenge. We need to start reacting to genocide. We need to start reacting to inhumanity. If I get passionate about it, if I talk a little too long, it's because I've seen it with my eyes. I hope I've been able to pass along some of this to you. I'm tired of us talking. We need to take an action. We spent millions of dollars prosecuting a pop star last year because he had the audacity to put a little boy in his bed. And yet Turkey sits there with blood on its hands and has taken an entire nation to bed, and we close our eyes and we close our ears. Yet Turkey gets away with all kinds of child abuse and molestation, and we're quiet about it. Why? Because we do not want to offend people. It's time to offend. It's time to take a proactive role in our lifetime to say enough is enough. If Turkey could have been stopped back then, maybe some of these other things would not have happened. And that maybe is not enough. Today we have a chance to stop Darfur. It's in our hands. It's like nothing else in our lives. We have a chance to do it. You talk about, well, do something here on your streets. We could control this stuff. In Darfur, you can't. It's in our hands. We need to take that role. And I yield the floor now. I'm sorry I talked so much, but I really want to impress upon you that it is the time to act. So thank you very much, and thank you for inviting me.
Thank you very much, Father Vazken, for those unique films and photos and that personal touch. I don't think I quite expected to see or feel the way I did when you got up to speak, but it certainly is touching and moving.